Love staying informed? Subscribe now and get unlimited access to local news, weather, and sports for just 99 cents a month for your first 3 months at inforum.news/join. Read every story, listen to every podcast, and download the apps that keep you informed and on the go 24 hours a day. So head to inforum.news/join right now to subscribe. What are you waiting for? Get 3 months of local news for just 99 cents a month at inforum.news/join.
You're listening to Plain Talk, the voice of North Dakota politics. I'm your host, Rob Port. If I sound distracted, it's because I've been busy covering this story all morning. I'm joined by my co-host, Chad Oban.
He's right of center, I'm left of center, both sides of the political spectrum.
I think it's cathartic. I think it's a necessary and proper debate. I'm glad we're having it.
And honestly, we have to do better.
Okay. I don't know why I'm getting blamed for this, right? Today, we're going to talk about legal fees. There was a committee hearing. As you may or may not know, our legislature meets a lot in the interim because, believe it or not, there are still decisions to be made in the interim. Now, they can't legislate, but they do have some level of discretion about appropriations and funding if things come up, and we've got to make decisions. So recently, the Attorney General's office was before the legislature here in the interim, and they were asking for more money for litigation. And coming out of that was a news report that the Democrats on the committee voted against that funding. And I wrote a column about it. It was pretty tough on our guest, House Minority Leader Zac Ista, and I wanted him to come on because Zac's always great about coming on and talking about some of that. And Zac, why don't I just throw it to you? Why did Democrats vote against the litigation? And to be clear, what we're talking about is it's funding for the Attorney General's office to pursue lawsuits over state law, basically, and there's a number of them. And their realm, everything from the abortion law that we've just been making headlines recently to things like the lawsuit with the federal government over the Dakota Access Pipeline protest response costs. So there's a lot of that stuff going on. Zac, make your case. Why did you guys vote no?
Yeah, Rob, thanks for having me. I appreciate it. And I'll reiterate here what I said to the budget section. My beef isn't with the Attorney General. I've been practicing law enough to know that litigation is expensive, and I believe our Attorney General does need adequate funds to do his job. You know, he's going to have to come back before the legislature in January, ask for his budget for the next biennium, and we'll get a chance to ask those questions about some of the lawsuits that he has filed or he has joined that are one of the drivers of litigation costs. And I think there'll be an open, transparent process where folks across the state can decide for themselves whether that's a good use of tax dollars. But the other big driver of litigation costs is defending laws that are enacted by the legislature. And on that front, I do believe the Attorney General, as a general rule, ought to be defending the duly adopted laws of our state. But that means it's incumbent upon us as a legislative branch to not pass laws that are unconstitutional and ripe for challenge. And really, my opposition here was largely based on us passing a law, the abortion ban that I described as extreme, that we all knew at the time when Republicans passed it was going to be challenged swiftly in court. And it has been, and the district court has ruled it unconstitutional. Like I said to the budget section, we made those warnings at the time that an extreme bill like that comes with financial costs to the state in terms of litigation expenses. I think it also comes with a reputational cost to the state as it sends a message to folks that we would love to recruit to live and work here, that maybe their rights as women aren't going to be protected in the state. But worst of all, it has real consequences for the life and health of women across our state who are in need of life-saving emergency care, and doctors aren't able to provide that as quickly or as reliably as possible because of this law.
Hey, Zac, one of the things that sort of frustrates me about this conversation is every legislative session, be it the abortion ban or transgender or other things, there'll be groups that say, if you pass this law, we're going to sue you. It is going to go into litigation. Why doesn't the legislature at that time appropriate the dollars for litigation? I mean, when people are saying this is going to happen, Why is the AG coming now looking for additional resources? Why didn't the legislature appropriate it at that time?
Well, it's a great question, Chad. My colleague then, House Minority Leader Josh Boucher, made that point on the House floor that, when bills come before us, they have these fiscal notes attached to them that tell us the economic impact. We do that in the interim for measures that are on the ballot. We try to estimate what the economic impact will be. We've also done that in terms of estimating the anticipated litigation costs. We did it with the measure that put age limits on congressional candidates in the state. So it's not something we don't know how to do. And I think it would be a good practice going forward to get a full sense of what the financial aspects of any piece of legislation is.
Aren't you guys kind of seeing this through a partisan lens, though? I mean, if we're talking about the abortion law specifically, you guys don't like the law. Setting all the legal issues aside, you don't like the law. Zach, you voted against it. So, of course, you don't like it. And you're going to say, well, anybody challenging it, that's a waste of time and waste of money. If we were in Minnesota and I was arguing to the legislature saying, don't pass a law banning coal-fired electricity from North Dakota because they're going to sue you and they're probably going to win because they've won before, couldn't I make the same argument you could? I mean, was Tim Walz wrong to sign that bill into law because it's gonna end up in court?
What I'd say when we talk about the abortion law specifically, it is yes. Democrats by and large oppose that law. We continue to oppose laws like that, but it was a law that was unconstitutional from the time it was introduced.
Hold on though. We live in a post-Roe world though. I mean, maybe once upon a time that argument held more weight. But the U.S. Supreme Court struck down the Roe v. Wade precedent. The Roe v. Wade precedent, every North Dakota court ruling on abortion that I'm aware of, relied on the Roe v. Wade precedent to strike down North Dakota laws. North Dakota courts don't really have. In fact, if you read Judge Romanick's order, he's the district court judge, Bruce Romanick. He's the district court judge that issued the ruling declaring it unconstitutional. He acknowledges there is no guidance in North Dakota jurisprudence. So, for you to say that it's unconstitutional, that's your opinion, and I guess Judge Romanick's, but this is hardly a settled question of law in the North Dakota courts. Am I wrong?
I think you are, Rob. It's not just my opinion. It was the opinion of 5 justices that heard a case, 5 justices of North Dakota Supreme Court that ruled on a case of the trigger ban we had in effect prior to the 2023 session. Remember last March of 2023, the Supreme Court issued a ruling striking down that trigger ban. And the North Dakota Supreme Court, not the federal Supreme Court, the North Dakota Supreme Court found in that ruling a fundamental right in our state constitution to abortions in limited circumstances, namely the health and life of the mother is at stake. So we weren't legislating in a legal vacuum when Senate Bill 2150 was passed in the 2023 legislative session. We knew the Supreme Court of our state had already recognized a fundamental right. I think the law that the Republicans put forward ignored that, didn't try to tailor itself narrowly to that ruling, and now we find ourselves back in court, and again with the law struck down as unconstitutional.
But that was the law that passed the legislature was changed, and understanding that you disagree that it was probably changed enough, but it was changed to address that ruling. And what Judge Romanick has issued is a much broader protection, what he's interpreted as a much broader protection for abortion in the state constitution than the state Supreme Court. I mean, he's going far beyond where the state Supreme Court was. So I guess my thing is, the way I objected to, the reason I wrote and objected to your stance on this was for 2 reasons. You called the position extreme, and while I'll admit that law is not the law that I would have written, it is a law that's supported by a lot of North Dakotans. I don't like that we're calling so many things extreme in an era where we're seeing real political extremism. People are trying to, we've had 2 assassination attempts on President Trump. A campaign office for the Harris Walz campaign was just shot at. We had, January 6th is a thing that has happened. I worry about language like that when we're just talking about disagreement over policy. But then on the other thing, I don't think that this is as settled as you're saying. I guess that's my point is I think the legislature has a right to push back against the judicial branch. The judicial branch is not necessarily the final say on all of these things.
Well, let's look at 2 things. One, when it comes to the scope of the constitutional right under North Dakota state law, Justice McEvers, in a concurrence in the initial Supreme Court decision, expressly noted that we haven't fully defined the scope of that right, and even suggested that it might be broader than the one that the court recognized.
It may not actually exist, too, by the way. That's the other part, is if that right exists, which part of the Constitution do we repeal to get rid of it?
Well, Rob, you posed that question in a column yesterday. I think you posed it as a rhetorical question, but I'm going to give you an answer. Look at Judge Romanik's decision. Look at Supreme Court jurisprudence. They have recognized that there are certain fundamental rights not spelled out word for word in our Constitution. They call them implicit in the concepts of ordered liberty in North Dakota. And it's not just a right to abortion. It's a right that you, Rob, me, Chad, enjoy as parents. The fundamental right to parent one's own children is a right you won't find spelled out in our state constitution. It's one the court has found. But if you want to amend our Constitution to disagree with what the district court ruled, that there's a fundamental right to abortion, it's simple. You bring a proposed amendment to Article 1, Section 1 of the Constitution that says, nothing in this section shall be construed to confer upon an individual in the state to the right to obtain or perform an abortion, and nothing in this section shall be construed to limit the legislature's ability to restrict the practice thereof.
Hey guys, can I participate at some point? At some point, I'd like to participate.
Let me finish my point on that one, okay. Rob. And if the Republicans think that's where the voters of North Dakota are, my challenge to them is this. There's not a single abortion clinic operating in North Dakota right now. The abortion care being provided in the state is in emergency life-saving situations. So let's drop the legal appeal. And when we come back in session in January, make the first bill you introduce a constitutional amendment doing that, take it to the people, let them decide if they're with it.
Hold on. Isn't that upside down? The judges have created this right. And now it's incumbent upon the people who don't think it exists. Now we have to amend the Constitution. Why couldn't I reverse that to you and say, if you want there to be a right to abortion in the Constitution, which no author of the language of that document ever intended to exist, if you want a right to abortion, why don't you amend the Constitution? Why is it incumbent upon people? For a judge creates a right, and then it's up to us to get rid of it. If you want the right to exist, why haven't you put a ballot measure forward?
Well, first of all, the North Dakota Supreme Court didn't create this right. They say it is inherent in the Constitution. And
it didn't exist until the judges read it and said, oh, this exists. It didn't exist until the judges issued opinion and say, oh, this exists.
I mean, if we're going to ignore the underpinnings of all constitutional law and jurisprudence, I guess we could create
That's not what I'm arguing. That's not what I'm arguing.
Hey, so Rob, I cut a meeting earlier short to come on and co-host this podcast with you, and you let me talk for 30 seconds in the first 15 minutes. Right. So I'm gonna just have Zac and I talk for a while now, okay?
Okay.
So, hey, Zac, my co-host said that this is not extreme. We're hearing stories all over the country of women dying and not getting the care that they need. I don't know how somebody could define that as not extreme, but I do.
Okay. Secondly, there's prisoners dying in jails in North Dakota right now for want of addiction treatment.
Different podcast, Rob.
Okay, but is it
have that conversation?
Okay, but is that extremism? But hold on, is it extremism? Okay, but if it's extremism.
So what we're talking about here is the fact that we're appropriating money time after time after time. Fiscal conservatives are saying that they want to spend money on these things. Every time I open up the newspaper, the Attorney General is jumping on another lawsuit. The Attorney General has proven in the last 6 months to a year that he's more than comfortable switching sides like he did on the lawsuit regarding redistricting, where he was defending the state and then they won and then he switched sides for that. Why doesn't, Zac, do you think the Attorney General maybe should let a pitch pass every once in a while rather than just spending taxpayer dollars time after time after time, often to just push a right-wing agenda that's a national right-wing agenda?
The short answer, Chad, is yes. I think if you look at the 40-some lawsuits the Attorney General has initiated or joined, you're going to find a pattern that it's always with other Republican attorneys general from across the state, and it's challenging Democratic administration in D.C. it's probably not the most newsworthy story that a Republican attorney general is advancing Republican priorities and that a Democratic legislator thinks we could spend our money elsewhere. I think when we get back into session in January, we have to ask those questions. We have to make sure that we are being good stewards of our tax dollars. I'm sure the attorney general will come before the legislature and explain why he thinks that those are good uses, and let's have that debate then. I do want to go back to this notion of whether or not this law is extreme. And I think, Rob, on your broader point, you are correct. Over the top language is the coin of the realm in the political dialogue today. And I think let me be clear. I know you have been clear. There's no room ever for violence, threats, intimidation, destruction of property. That is just never the answer. And I think all three of us are probably humble enough to admit we have fallen short of the standard we are trying to set in our own communications. We'll probably fail in the future. That should not
in the next 10 minutes.
In maybe the next 10 minutes. But on this instance, Rob, I really do stand behind my language in calling this abortion ban extreme. I think that rhetoric matches reality. I think it is extreme for the government to force a rape victim to carry her rapist baby to term. I think it is extreme for the government to force a child victim of incest to carry that child to term.
But North Dakota's law doesn't do those things.
It does. After 6 weeks, we are asking a 12-year-old child to know within the first 6 weeks that she is pregnant and that she can avail herself of that narrow window of rights. I think that is an extreme restriction on that person's freedom and liberty.
Yeah. It's really hard because we have the abortion is always an 800-pound gorilla, right? And it's hard because there's a debate here to be had about litigation expenses. And I think that if we had Attorney General Keith Ellison in North Dakota and he was pursuing Democratic, we would see the roles reversed, and it would be Republicans complaining about the expense and Democrats, defending it as being, pure as the driven snow. So some of this is just ideological lenses. We're just going to disagree on what's the right use of resources here. The abortion thing is so difficult. And again, I will maintain that I am so glad that Roe v. Wade is gone. It frustrates me that this completely misguided judicial philosophy where we're going to read rights into the Constitution. I think if you want something to be protected as a right, which we've done with right to a jury, right to free speech, right to assemble, all these other rights, we have explicitly laid them out in our Constitution. I don't like the idea that we're going to add additional rights to that because a judge thinks they should exist, or a judge thinks they do exist in the penumbras of the law. And I understand that lawyers and judges are very fond of this approach because it gives them all sorts of power that they wouldn't have otherwise. But I think it's excessive. And frankly, that's a long-standing conservative point of view. It's excessive. And I think when I look at what Roe did to this country politically, where we elevated this one area of law and we said, nobody can touch this. This is above everything else. This is too important to subject to the democratic process. I say that is wrong. Every part of our society is subject to the democratic process. And if you want there to be a right to abortion, then you should create one through the laws and through the process that exists that's available to you. But I don't think we should create one because a lawyer sued somebody and then a judge signed off on it. Like, that's wrong, fundamentally wrong.
I think it's just a basic principle of how we interpret and apply our constitutions. We will always be called upon to recognize rights that are implicit in those broad pronouncements of the right to life, liberty, happiness, and safety. And whatever one thinks about Roe, I think the consequences that have befallen women in this country since Donald Trump's court struck down Roe have far outweighed the damage the political dialogue around Roe had. We saw reports last week that there's been a 56% increase in maternal mortality in the state of Texas, which has one of these bans. We read the story of Amber Thurman, a young woman in Georgia who died after developing an infection, going into sepsis, and her doctors waited for hours and hours and hours, deciding if they could provide the life-saving care she needed without going to jail for 10 years. I think those are much greater risks than discomfort in the political dialogue.
It's not discomfort, though. We are a nation that has come to not trust its institutions anymore. And I think when institutions exceed their boundaries and go beyond and shut people out from having control over what their laws are, it redounds to the sort of political violence and upheaval that we're seeing across the country. I'm not saying that Roe v. Wade is the reason, but I think we can all agree abortion has been one of the most divisive, polarizing political subjects in this country. And what I'm seeing since Roe was put down is all of a sudden you have the presidential candidate for the Republican Party is essentially pro-choice. You are seeing Republicans moderate on this issue. That is happening in front of our eyes. Now, I understand there's some terrible things out there that are happening too, but this is moving us in a healthy direction. And if Roe hadn't been decided in the first place, we may never have been there. This abortion could have been in our rearview mirror a long time ago.
I'm going to jump in here a little bit,
Brad, and then I'll hear your question. Republicans have not moderated on this issue. Look at in North Dakota. The abortion ban was written and introduced by a Republican, co-sponsored exclusively by Republicans. 116 Republicans, 93% of the caucus voted for it.
They're
the Republican governor signed it into law, and it was all made possible because a Republican president appointed 3 justices to the Supreme Court with the intention of overturning Roe, and those justices did as that Republican president intended.
I would argue that there's a difference between disagreeing with the legal philosophy behind the Roe v. Wade precedent and also agreeing with some of the more draconian abortion bans. And how do you explain that Donald Trump was against a 6-week abortion ban in Florida? I hate that you're putting me in the position.
Your point about Republicans moderating on this is laughable. When the congressional candidate in North Dakota, Julie Fedorchak, is calling for a national abortion ban, that she's running on the fact that she supports a national abortion ban. The fact that you're using, honest to God, Rob, you are just killing me in this podcast, man. Like, nobody's allowed to finish their spot.
It's tough when it's 2-on-1.
Not 2-on-1. I've talked for 48 seconds so far.
All right.
I'm a bystander on this thing. The point is, Julie Fedorchak supports a national abortion ban. For you to point to Donald Trump changing his position on something as an example of Republicans moderating, I would encourage you to listen to things you've said in the past about Donald Trump changing his position on things. I don't think that's a pretty good indicator of where Republicans are in this state. So my question back to you, Rob, is why not do what Zac suggested? Put it on the ballot that having an abortion ban in the state should go on the Constitution. Why shouldn't that be the option?
Well, they should. I think it's wildly hypocritical for us to say, well, the judges read this into the law, so therefore now it's incumbent upon you to amend the Constitution. But absolutely, that has been my whole argument. This should be subject to the democratic process. And normally what we hear in rhetoric from the Democrats is this is too important to subject to that. People's rights shouldn't be subject to legislatures, to which I respond, people's rights are subject to the whims of legislatures all the time. They make the law. That is what our society is organized around. So absolutely, they should. Somebody should, if the courts succeed in manufacturing a right to the Constitution, shame on them. That is completely wrong. But if that's going to be the status quo, then yes, we should absolutely have a constitutional amendment, maybe competing constitutional amendments, to determine what our abortion law should be, because it should be up to us as a society, not a judge in a courtroom.
Well, Rob, I think we have to note an irony here that this November, there's actually a measure on the ballot that is going to make it harder for folks in North Dakota to avail ourselves of that democratic process. Yeah. That's measure 2. And I don't think it's just a coincidence that the same Republican lawmaker who wrote the abortion ban wrote the measure that became measure 2 on this ballot. They wanted to pass a extreme restrictive abortion ban, and measure 2 makes it harder to overturn them at the ballot box. I think that's why folks really have to get out and oppose measure 2 to preserve that democratic avenue you talk about.
Let me ask you this honest question. Don't you think that all the lawyering and everything, and even the initiated measure process, doesn't that take lawmakers off the hook? Because I feel like as long as these things exist, then it's like there's no pressure on lawmakers to respond to the public pressure, because we just do an initiated measure, or the courts will step in and take care of it. I think that happens a lot at the federal level, where Congress just punts. They pass vague law and then leave it up to the courts to fill in the blanks, and shame on them for that. But I don't know. I think that if you want change, you ought to consider who you're voting for in the legislature. The legislature matters.
Well, on that point, I absolutely agree, Rob. So I invite all of your listeners that are voting in North Dakota to look at the record of the legislative candidates when it comes to this issue of abortion, if that's important to you. You'll find that every Republican incumbent on the ballot this cycle, with the notable exception of Steve Schwantek in District 10, voted for this ban. 2 were absent for the final vote. I suspect they would have also voted for it. Those are folks in Fargo and Grand Forks, folks that are otherwise styling themselves to be centrist and moderate. They voted for this ban. So I hope your listeners who are voting in our state will consider that record. I hope they'll vote against Measure 2, which preserves a democratic process to go forward with a ballot measure in the future. And I think it's time we had to elect candidates who are going to support and promote women's reproductive freedom and reject candidates seek to restrict it.
I don't see the North Dakota voters are going to vote that. I don't know that they care enough about this issue that it's going to impact the way they vote. I mean, we've had these debates in the past. It hasn't had an impact. In terms of where North Dakotans are
at on this, including the personhood ballot that went down overwhelmingly 75-25.
But that was when it's a single issue. I do agree. I think that the abortion law that the legislature passed is too restrictive for what most North Dakotans want. But the calculus that goes into that is, do they care enough to vote for someone else, a Democrat, if they even have an alternative in their district? Do they care enough to vote a different way? And I would argue that they don't. If it's a single issue vote, sure. I think if you referred that law to the ballot, I think there's a good chance it would fail. Because it's too extreme. Not extreme. Boy, I almost used the word.
Speaking to my point, I was going to say some people would call this an extreme measure because it's so much more restrictive. So, Zach, I want to ask you a question. So last week, you guys had this conversation about the attorney generals and what were Democrats hoping to accomplish by sort of making that an issue? I mean, like, obviously these lawsuits are going to take place. Obviously, this money is going to be appropriated. This did get a fair amount of attention, but like, what is the ultimate goal? Is it to draw attention to the abortion ban? Is it to draw attention to the amount of money that's being spent on litigation because of things that the North Dakota legislature has passed? What are you guys trying to accomplish there?
Look, it's twofold, Chad. One is we always have to be having the conversation about being mindful and good stewards of tax dollars. I know that's something you both care a lot about. How we, spend on litigation is part and parcel of that conversation. But 2, it is an opportunity to remind voters of what has happened to abortion and women's healthcare rights in this state. It is part of this conversation we are having today. Rob, maybe you're right. Maybe not enough voters have this issue front of mind when they go to the ballot box. But I think more ought to, because I do think our ban stands out as more restrictive than other states across the country. I don't think it strikes the right balance. I think the protections of Roe v. Wade did strike a better balance. And I think voters across the state would like to see us move in that direction rather than the opposite way the Republican supermajority has taken us.
What would an abortion law look like? Let's say we got a blank slate and we say, Zach, we got to write a law about abortion in North Dakota. What would it look like? Where would you draw the line for when abortion is legal and when it's not?
At a fundamental level, Rob, it's not about where you draw the lines, but who gets to draw the line. And this is about the government's ability to restrict people's private decisions. I trust women, doctors, pastors, family members to decide where to draw that line. But when you're talking about putting pen to paper on policy, I think a starting point is to restore those protections of Roe versus Wade. Remember, that wasn't unfettered access to abortion anytime, any place.
It was the viability standard.
There was the viability standard. Essentially in that pre-viability, that first trimester, when well over 90% of abortions happened, the government had little to no ability to restrict them. The later you got to pregnancy, the government couldn't place undue burdens on a woman's right to choose. At the very end of the pregnancy, the government was allowed to create more restrictions. That is an important starting point. I'm hopeful that when we elect a new president, new Congress, new Senate, that the federal government will pass a law federally restoring those rights, and maybe that will help settle the political legal landscape going forward. But if not, I think that would be a great starting point here in North Dakota.
It's funny how differently we look at this sometimes, because we held up Julie Fedorchak as an example of an extreme position on abortion. She was on the podcast and she explained what she would want from a federal abortion ban, and she said it was more like a floor. what she would like to see is a ban. I think she mentioned somewhere between 15 and 20 weeks. And I'm not sure how that's incompatible with what you just said, Zach, which is the viability standard, because once you get into the 15 to 20 week realm, you're starting to get into the area where it's viable. And so in a way, she's advocating for enshrining, saying as a matter of federal law, that abortion should be legal before 15 or 20 weeks. That's what she's saying, which is also kind of what you're saying. And yet we call one of these positions extreme and the other not.
Well, I would hope that broader point could hold true, even on an issue that evokes such passion like abortion rights, that we could come together and realize maybe there is room for more agreement than we perceive at first blush. At the end of the day, when we're talking about this as elected officials, as people in the political and government sphere, it is about what the role of the government is, the role of the government to restrict certain rights. That doesn't mean we can't be respectful, courteous, understanding of everybody's personal views on this. I have just the utmost respect for folks, whether it's because of their personal morals, their religious faith, that they view the issue differently. What I care about is what's the government's role when it comes to enacting public policy.
It's hard when you call them extreme, though. And I guess maybe that's my point. And yeah, I understand, like, words are hard. I work with words for a living. So maybe it's context, maybe it's and I don't think you're trying to say, well, these people are on the same level as the January 6th people. I understand that's not your point. I think we need to be more precise. That was my point.
I don't know how, not to get, last week you're upset about elitist, this week you're upset about extreme. I don't know how, again, when women aren't getting the care they need because of these bans around the country, that we don't call them extreme. I mean, there's people dying. You brought up the assassination attempts, which obviously are terrible. People didn't die there, right? I mean, I'm not saying either of these things are great. They're all extreme. When people are getting hurt because of getting sick or trying to have a baby or all those kind of things. So I think that, and Rob, you tiptoed right up to that line of calling it extreme yourself. So
I was searching for the word. It's too restrictive is what I was trying to say. Extreme was in my brain though, but it's too the law that North Dakota passed is too restrictive. I would draw the line 15 to 20 weeks with some pretty broad exemptions after that. That's where I would put the law. And as far as stopping abortion, if it's up to me, I would say let's make pregnancy a choice as much as we can. Let's focus on contraceptives. Let's fund better, as a nation, fund better research into contraceptives, make contraceptives more available, better sex education, which Republicans have fought in a lot of ways too.
Let's make sure we have paid leave for women and men when they give birth. Let's make sure we have the right tax code for families that are with diapers and car seats and cribs and all of that. Let's have universal no-cost school meals when their kid kindergarten has to pay for lunch every day.
We talked about that, some of that. North Dakota Right to Life, the people during the last legislative session, post-Roe, they made that the focus is let's make it easier for people to choose to have the child. And they focused on a lot of that stuff. And then they ended up, the people who were working for North Dakota Right to Life ended up getting fired because for promoting that, which is too bad. But there is, and I know like the Catholics, agree on a lot of it. So that's some low-hanging fruit that I think.
But I also think the other thing that wasn't mentioned is adoption and making adoption more accessible to both birthing parents and parents who are adopting kids. I want to go back to Julie Fedorchak's and you sort of making that comparison. I mean, one is she's suggesting a floor, and I think the other thing is discussing it as a ceiling. So those are very different perspectives, but I think that we can have a conversation about what is a good place for us to get, but I don't see those two positions, Rob, as being the same or close to the same, with one being a ceiling and one being
I think sometimes we get so entrenched, there is room for agreement on this issue. And really, if you look at public opinion, most people support, they don't want abortion to be legal all the way up to term. They don't. Most Americans view that as an extreme position, if we're going to use that word. Most Americans don't want abortion entirely banned either. So most Americans are somewhere in that middle. And I feel like we can craft policy that's somewhere in that middle that's going to protect women, but also say there is a line here that we're going to draw. We can do that as a country if we just unclench a little bit and talk to one another. I think that is possible. And that start then, and that debate could start if the judges just stay out of it and let us do this.
Well, Rob, I would just add, that is where we were for 5 decades with Roe v. Wade being the law of the land. It was the Supreme Court that took us away from that. Let's go back.
Yeah. Isn't that what I said? Yeah, I want to go back. Well, I'm glad Roe v. Wade's gone. I don't understand what you just said there.
He was saying we did have exactly the moderate position with Roe v. Wade. And so I think, again, you guys have the exact opposite position. Zach's right, you're wrong.
Okay. Well,
that's great, gentlemen.
Listen, just calling balls and strikes here, Port.
Okay. That's I listen, I think we as a society, we didn't solve abortion. We didn't find a middle ground under Roe. I think we can now that it's open to the democratic process. But we should end this here because we've gone overhead. Zac, thank you so much for coming on. And
I appreciate it. I'll take my comeuppance. Congratulations to both of you on having playoff baseball teams. I will continue to watch the Twins self-destruct in real time.
The Dodgers are about to blow their division lead against the Padres this week. I don't want to talk about baseball until they win one of the next 2 days, because otherwise, if they lose the division, they go to Colorado and immediately start playing. That is not a good scenario for a team with no pitching.
Yeah, we just lost one of our pitchers to an elbow MRI. But I'm just glad that after the second half that the Yankees had, somehow we're still in the running for the best record in baseball. I don't know how that happened. We failed, kind of like Donald Trump. We failed forward.
I still think the Tigers or the Royals are going to fall apart, and your Twins are going to find a way to get into the first round.
I love it when the Twins are in the postseason, because the Yankees then get to play them in the postseason, and that's that's almost as good as a bye, really, in some ways. That was me, Zach.
I wish I had a witty retort today, but I will sit here in my misery and let you have this one.
I will admit that is the meanest thing I said to you in this episode. So, Zach, thank you so much for coming on.
The cold cases you see at The Vault have captivated readers across our region for years. At The Vault Podcast, our team of professional reporters takes you further into those stories with new interviews from family members, investigators, and experts. Check out The Vault at inforum.com/The Vault and subscribe to The Vault wherever you find your podcasts.
All right, welcome back. Chad was just telling me I've been a little feisty the last couple episodes.
Yeah, just calm down, Port.
I will admit it feels a little after everything that gets heaped on me for not being a true conservative anymore and everything else. It kind of feels good to remind people, no, I'm still the same conservative I've always been. I just recognize that Donald Trump is a dumpster fire.
Yeah, so yeah, I just, somebody described you as Raging Rob after last week's podcast with Ellie Shockley. So I think that's where we got to get through this election, bring you down a little bit.
Yeah.
You're too angry.
It is
too hungry.
The thing is, like, it's been, and I've talked about this, like, it's hard when people you've known for a long time, people who have been involved in your life suddenly are, saying and writing horrible things about you on social media because you don't like Donald Trump. Like you get treated like a traitor and everything else. But it feels good just to mix it up a little bit with disagree with liberals. Zach even made that joke when I invited him on. He's like, it's about time we got around to disagreeing again, Rob.
So I do think it's a little bit funny for the people who criticize you for not being conservative enough. As somebody who's left of center, I want to go on record and saying Rob is still consistently wrong, like he's always been on so many of these things. But, talking about abortion, I think we're sort of talking about this off air, and you were making the point, liberals make the mistake of, just sort of putting it all in the courts. And I think there's some truth to that. And I think liberals on the issue of abortion got a little bit, leaned too heavy into the courts. I mean, Democrats had big majorities in the Senate and the House and a Democrat president many times.
Most recently under Barack Obama.
Yeah, they could have got this done. They could have codified it then. Republicans might have undone it as well, but it just seems like it is a risky proposition to leave things in the hands of judges. I like the idea of some sort of constitutional measure to discuss this issue, put it in the Constitution clear, and then we don't have to fight within the courts on it.
Yeah. And also one thing, and I like, Zach just sent me a text message thanking for, coming on, and he says I'm a worthy rhetorical adversary and he enjoys it. I like mixing it up with smart people like Zach. One of his,
I like watching the two of you.
I'm sorry. It's hard when you get into a back and forth, and I wasn't trying to crowd you out on purpose, but it's when you're passionate, I guess it comes out. One of the things that frustrated me though is when, and Democrats do this a lot, when you ask them, okay, because I think most Democrats would agree they don't support abortion up to term, like the day before the due date. They don't support that. So if we're going to make a law, we've got to have a standard. I think the viability standard is really hard to have as a standard because it's a moving target. It's going to evolve over time as we get better with natal care and everything else. So where would you draw the line? Like what does the law look like? And I remember I asked Carl Mum this as well, and she didn't have a good answer. And so that frustrates me. So if you don't like 6 weeks, then where would you draw the line, or how would you craft the law? And they don't answer. They say, well, let's just bring back Roe. Well, Roe was
Let me try to answer it and sort of talk about the fact of why that question is very difficult for people to answer. The reality is where Zach's at and where I'm at, quite frankly, is I don't think the government should be making that determination. I know of scenarios where women have been 4, 5, 6 months along, and something has happened to that pregnancy where it's not going to come to term. That baby's never going to be born alive, right? And so why should the government say, hey, you need to, keep the baby until it's fully developed? Why should the government make that decision? I don't know the timeline of when that would happen, but it seems to me, again, the doctor, the potential mother, and their God are the best people to make that determination, because this isn't clean, right? I mean, we all know that not every pregnancy is conception, go through the 9 months, you have your baby and everything is fine. That's not the way the world works. But there are going to be situations where things come up that maybe having a too rigid of a line in the sand in the Constitution or in state law can cause problems. So I think that's why people like me don't have an answer to that question, Rob.
But shouldn't you need an answer? Because I understand you don't want it to be too rigid. Okay, but I'm not. I guess I'm asking you. Like, we have to have a law. We have to have something.
Yeah, but what? So what would you say to that potential mother who's in that situation, and it's past what the state has determined what that line is? Is the expectation then that she has to go to another state to get care? That and what if she doesn't have the resources to go to another state? Does she have to go through the mental anguish of, oh, congratulations, you're having a baby? Well, yeah, the baby's, going to be born and not live. I mean, again, why is the government making that decision for how she wants to handle that situation?
It's really hard. I mean, but we and one of the things that bothers me is we pretend like this is we only struggle with life and death, harm and no harm issues in the context of abortion, when that's not true. We make decisions about whether or not to go to war, right? I mean, we make all sorts of decisions through the government. We can make this one, and I don't know that I have all the right answers. I would draw the line probably at 15 weeks, and then I would say afterwards, if you have a doctor who will attest to the fact that it's necessary for the life of the mother, or there's extenuating circumstances. And I'm not going to legislate on the fly here, but I think you understand the intent of what I'm trying to express. We can build exemptions into the law. And then if we find that the exemptions are good enough, we can continue to refashion the law to make it work, and I think there could be majorities behind that. But right now, we're stuck between the people who don't want it, who don't want access to abortion to exist at all, and people who won't define their position.
But why do you, if you're still saying it's up to the doctor to give that trigger to allow it to take place, why have the law on this? Because you're already there, right? I mean, it's not like a woman is going in without the consultation of a doctor to make that determination. Why would you need a law than to basically say what's already happening?
Because I think what people want to prevent is using abortion as contraception.
Yeah, and I think that's often a misconception, right? I don't think
maybe it's not happening.
The vast majority of the time that's probably not. And then then is there a ban on using contraceptive as contraceptive, right? Is there then a ban on IVF, right? I mean, and so I don't know how, like, I know you don't want to use extreme in some of the language that's been used the last couple of weeks. I generally agree with that, but I don't know how you describe a position, and not talking about this bill, but like a position that would outlaw the IVF or make it virtually impossible. How is that not an extreme position, right? I mean, like, I don't know how else you would describe that.
Yeah, I mean, other than, it was once upon a time illegal for cancer patients to get access to marijuana. Right. And I think the people who really believe in that as a treatment would argue that they were put through a great deal of suffering, or were put in a position to have to go onto the black market and maybe deal with sketchy people. We deal with these things all the time. It's hard. Policy making is messy. And I don't have all the right answers. The thing that I don't want, though, is I want us to wade through the mud. I want us to wade through the mud and try to find something that's going to work, that the majority of people are going to sign off on, rather than leaving it up to a judge to write. I mean, that's what makes me so mad about Romanik's position, is we're going to have the judges craft a standard. And I would argue the Roe standard was, again, it was a viability standard. And if you look at the endless lawsuits and protests and everything that we had, that didn't satisfy anybody because it was a bad standard. I don't want to go back to that. I want it to remain in the democratic process. I want our legislature to be able to craft laws, and when they pass bad laws, then we can refer the law to the ballot, or we can elect somebody different as a legislature, or we can, my feelings about the initiated measure process aside, it exists. They can avail themselves of that as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to draft policy to understand every single potential personal outcome, right? Especially with things as complicated as childbirth. End of life, probably very similar to this as well, right? I mean, how do you handle end of life decisions? I just, at some point, this is often funny when we've talked about this a lot over the last year, where progressives seem to be on the side of, personal freedom and that kind of thing these days. But I mean, I would rather the government stay out of the decision unless there is the perfect policy. And I don't know if the perfect policy exists.
And I think the other hard part of it is something that I know you don't stipulate to, but I think it's hard for a lot of people to let go of the fact that you're talking about another life, a separate life, or at least the potential for that life that you're ending. And I think that's hard for people to grapple with. Under what conditions is it okay to stop that life on its continuum?
Right. That's the hardest part of this, right? I mean, when you don't have an agreed upon fact of when life begins, when you have disagreement on that. I mean, I don't know how you come to a policy. With that being said, I mean, you've been there where you've seen your kid and the heartbeats and those kind of things. It's hard to deny that at some point there's a kid in there, right? And I don't know exactly what that line is, but again, there's also a life of the mother.
Right.
There's also those kind of situations as well that have to be part of this equation. And it's, I don't know what the answer is, but I know I don't want moms dying and not being able to get the health care they need. And that's the other thing here that's really at play. We need to figure out how to protect doctors in these situations, because doctors are getting a little nervous about what they can and cannot do because it's not clear. Are they abiding by, the oath to protect your patient versus, oh my God, what's in the state law in this very conservative state?
But again, we regulate the way we prescribe drugs, and we went through that. I remember a time. I remember when there was big pushback from doctors groups and everything against the federal government that was trying to crack down on opiate prescriptions. And they were saying they're prescribing them too much. And the doctors were saying, don't come between us and our patients. We know what we're doing. Well, it turned out a lot of doctors were in on the game.
Yeah. Or doctors being against medical marijuana.
Right.
Because they already had the magic solution.
So the thing is I get it. I mean, most doctors are good doctors. and they're just good people trying to do a job. I'm not demonizing doctors, but what I'm saying is we make laws around doctors all the time. This, again, none of this is new.
And I know you said you were going to legislate on the fly, but earlier you talked about, unless the doctor says that, there's something going on, it's that exact situation, right? And so how do you determine who's the doctor that's doing it for the right things and who's the doctor who's doing it for political reasons, ideology? I'll sign anybody's form after 4 months to get an abortion.
Which is kind of, in some ways, it's kind of where we're at with medical marijuana in North Dakota right now. There are places you can go where if you want marijuana, you can get marijuana. That's the reality. By the way, we're going to be talking about that more on Friday. We're going to have a debate over Measure 5, which is recreational marijuana. And part of the reason why I think we should pass it is because the idea that we're restricting anybody who wants marijuana from getting marijuana right now is a joke. So anyway, we're going to have that debate on Friday.
Yeah, I look forward to that debate because I think both sides have some interesting points. And I think Mr. Finken will be able to push back on the point that you just made there that I've made to him personally many times.
He will. Yes, he will push back on that. The abortion thing, obviously we're not going to solve that issue on this episode.
But Rob, going back to the cost of litigation, really my biggest frustration is why don't they build this into the fiscal note?
Yeah.
Why don't they appropriate the money? And to Zach's point, they're able to do that on different, like the ballot measure on age restrictions. They were able to build that into the fiscal note. We know we're going to get sued over this.
They do sometimes appropriate funds when they anticipate litigation. They've done that. I think one of the challenges is you can't anticipate the direction that because you're dealing with, it's an adversarial process and you don't necessarily know what the other side's going to do. So all of a sudden, if the other side says, we're going to bring in all this evidence, and now it creates a big need where, oh gosh, we got to go out and find a bunch of expert witnesses to come in, or is the judge going to dismiss it? Do we end up in a jury trial? I think it can be difficult.
Or legislators don't want to admit during the legislative process that there is going to be funds that will be put out if they pass a bill.
I agree that they are probably reticent to acknowledge the costs and they could be more transparent about them. I think it's simultaneously true that it can be very, very hard to anticipate the costs in what is a not, we all know the courts are notoriously hard to forecast. We don't necessarily know what they're going to do. So that's hard. I think it's hard to come up with an exact dollar amount. And maybe they're afraid where, well, if we appropriate a dollar amount, then it goes over. Now we're getting slammed even more because they're like, oh, they went over budget. I don't know that it's
I think they should rate. We, again, just like in the age discrimination of federal, they can guesstimate, right? They can make their best estimate, and we should do that. We should know how much bills are going to cost when we pass them. Yeah. To the best of our ability.
I think they could be better at acknowledging it. I'm not sure we're going to be as good at guessing what it's going to cost. And by the way, one of the things we missed about all this, the biggest cost of litigation that came before the budget section was North Dakota's lawsuit against the federal government over the Dakota Access Pipeline protests. And I would argue that's not North Dakota's fault.
Sure.
The federal government, frankly, the Obama administration, left us in a bad way. They refused to evict the protesters who were camping illegally. They refused to send federal law enforcement. We had Democratic leadership from other states, including Governor Mark Dayton in Minnesota, refused to even send state resources to assist with North Dakota. So that was a bad situation. So that specific debate, and I understand all the points you're making about these other things, but the bulk of what we're dealing with right now is DAPL.
Yeah, and you couldn't see that coming, right? That I agree with you. That's something that does need to be appropriated and isn't the fault of the North Dakota legislature.
Yeah. So anyway, but I agree with you in that I think that we could be more clear when we're discussing, because that's where all this funding is. It's in the Attorney General's budget. When we're discussing the Attorney General's budget, we could be more intentional about saying we're going to have litigation costs. This is what we're anticipating they're going to be, understanding they may need to come back to more, and that's not necessarily anybody's fault.
Right. And not admitting that you think there is an actual case to rule something unconstitutional, just to recognize the fact that some people will challenge the law.
Yeah.
And
also recognizing that how we view some of these lawsuits is going to be partisan. If I lived in Minnesota, I probably wouldn't like a lot of the stuff that Keith Ellison's doing. Democrats
Sure.
who live in North Dakota probably aren't going to like a lot of the stuff Drew Wrigley's doing. Well, he's a Republican, and
Right. No, I agree with that. And that's why I keep going back to us on the front end trying to figure out the cost of these things. No matter if you're in Minnesota or if you're in North Dakota, you should try to figure out how to appropriate the dollars on the front end and not just have sort of, and obviously there's not an open checkbook,
Right.
They still have to come back and ask for the money.
And also we should remember, sometimes it's not our laws that we're defending. Sometimes it's Minnesota passed a law and now we've got to litigate them, or the federal government passed a law and now we've got to litigate with them.
And I'm going to join 35 other attorney generals on a lawsuit against the feds.
I mean, listen, if some of those, if we didn't challenge some of those lawsuits, the impact it would have on North Dakota's energy industry would be pretty bad. And you want to talk about funding available for school lunches and some of the other things we want to do.
Replace property taxes. I mean, all the different things that we need to do in the state.
Hey,
I understand. And I'm speaking that very generally, while not knowing anything about any specific lawsuit. But it just seems like all the time, there's all these lawsuits. It just seems like it's constant of signing on to another. And maybe the feds should lay off a little bit.
I am a little weary though of hearing about it's the lawsuits, and then also it's, well, Congress is going to investigate. Congress is going to investigate this, that, and the other thing. In both instances, attorney generals, it is their job to protect their states in court and to protect their state's laws in court. It is Congress's job to provide oversight. We are getting hugely over. It has become so partisan.
It's become so extreme in the way that I'm going to start working the word extreme into, I think our play-in music should be the band Extreme.
You're just going to keep saying it over and over again until we all achieve sonic satiation, and it just doesn't mean anything anymore.
It has no meaning left anymore.
I wrote a column today about Measure 4, and talking to this with the chair of the Keep It Local committee. It's my feeling, and you probably don't want to talk about this because we don't want to give anybody the impression that you don't have to go vote on this. You need to vote. My feeling at this point in the race, as people are beginning to vote, is that it's not going to pass. I don't perceive that they have the pro side, the pro Measure 4 side. I don't think they have the resources. I don't think they've done a good enough job of articulating what will happen if it passes. They haven't provided a replacement, and I think they're still being drugged down by Rick Becker, who has yet to demonstrate that he can build a political consensus around much of anything.
Yeah, the one thing I would say is people are clearly frustrated by property taxes. I think that there's starting to become some consensus around the state that the legislature will do something on this. I know the legislators I'm talking to say they're going to do something about this. So help me, if this thing goes down, which I'm confident that it'll go down. If the legislature doesn't do anything on property taxes, good luck moving forward, because the message is being sent, and not just by the proponents of this. I mean, I talk to people who are so opposed to this that are frustrated by property taxes.
You're talking to one right now.
Yeah,
even though mine went down.
Yeah, so did mine. Thank you, $500 tax credit. But I think the other thing that is so frustrating from my perspective is, and we've talked about this, nobody knows if their sales tax went up 25% one year. Like, nobody tracks that. I mean, I challenge you, Rob, next year, you figure out how much money you spent on sales tax, then keep track of that year after year after year. And I guarantee with inflation, your sales tax did double.
I mean, I could do it. I mean, with digital transactions now, I could do it. The amount of time that it would take out of my life to track that, I'm just not going to.
Property taxes, people are mad about because they're transparent.
Yeah,
I think we want transparency.
That was one of the points our guest from the Tax Foundation made. One thing I wanted to get, and I'm hearing this, and I wanted to get your reaction to it, is a lot. I'm hearing all of a sudden, I've had several people emailing me, reacting to my columns or whatever, saying this is the only way we're going to stop local spending. They're spending too much money, so we got to take property taxes away. And my rebuttal to them has been, have you seen what the legislature's been doing with the state budget? Because the idea that we're going to take it away from the locals and we're going to send it to Bismarck, who are paragons of fiscal restraint. The state, the total appropriations, which includes special funds, general fund, federal dollars, has increased almost 44% since the 2017-19 biennium.
There's COVID dollars in there. I mean, there's obviously some...
I understand that I'm talking to a Democrat who doesn't maybe mind some of the growth as much as I do, but I mean, the idea that suddenly we're going to enter a new era of fiscal restraint, no, they're going to find different ways to tax you. You're going to pay the bill.
But I also think that people, when they're looking at political subs and how they spend, need to also be thoughtful about this. I think about Bismarck, where we've expanded, not to go all Doug Burgum walkability score here, but we've expanded the amount of streets in North Dakota or in Bismarck by a huge amount. When you expand the footprint, we need more for snow removal. We need more. I mean, all these different things. That's going to cost more money.
Yeah.
And I think that people need to accept that as they're, living on, 3 acres out in the suburbs somewhere, that does create a situation where there's going to need to be more resources.
Yeah, and then the city had to pave a road out there. They had to bury all the infrastructure, the water pipe, the sewer pipe, the electricity, everything else to go out there. Then they have to service the road. They have to plow the road. They have to come out and collect garbage, perhaps. I don't think...
I want to live in a city that's growing and there's development going on, but we also just need to accept the fact that that's going to cost more money.
Yeah, and it's that fundamental disconnect from voters where they want certain things and then they also don't want to pay for them. And we struggle with that at the federal level. We struggle with that at the local level.
And I think that in North Dakota, because of oil development, we've sort of been having our cake and eating it too. I mean, we have had more services and paying less in taxes.
I think one of the things that has allowed us to, because really what should happen is the rubber's got to meet the road locally. And we got to say, either we do development this way or we have lower property taxes. Either we avoid these amenities, and say we're not going to have a new park or a new water park or whatever it is that we're doing, or we're going to have higher property taxes. We got to have...
You can pick up your garbage once every 2 weeks, right? Snowplow, it'll take 3 or 4 days after a blizzard to get it done. These are choices. So
I would argue that what has allowed us to sort of avoid that reckoning on property taxes, which as angsty as people are about it, they're not really showing up at meetings where these budgets get made. They're sparsely attended. You might have a few, local gadflies showing up, but for the most part, the public's not engaged in that process. We have been able to hide this issue in oil tax revenue at the state level. We've had $7 billion when you tally up all the buy downs that the legislature has done, taking over most of school funding, taking over social services, things like the $500 credit we just did. They've done other credits in the past. When we add all that up, $7 billion that we're still paying for as taxpayers. We've just hidden it in statewide surpluses. Eventually, we're not going to be able to do that anymore. So,
especially if we start using the legacy fund now for, to pay off the property taxes if this thing passes, right? I mean, I also, people don't talk enough about the Common Schools Trust Fund. The Common Schools Trust Fund, which has all this money in it, where the interest pays for K through 12 education, a big chunk of the state, your property taxes would be so much higher if it wasn't for the Common Schools Trust Fund. And there are people who want to dip into that and start spending it. And it's such a dumb, short-sighted view of how to keep property taxes low.
That's the first domino to fall. And it's where those dominoes lead is not a place that you necessarily want to go. It's what I really want from the lead, because we agree, Measure 4, I think, is going to fail, but you need to get out and vote. The legislature cannot just do more buy downs. They cannot just send more money. So I think whatever they do has to put the heat on locals. You have to say, if you want to solve these problems, the responsibility's got to be locally. I think the big thing that the legislature could do is on valuations. I think there's got to be something we can do where people aren't just getting automatic tax increases based on increased value in their property that most of them aren't going to realize anytime soon if they do at all.
Well, I think it's also interesting when I talk to local political sub-leaders, these aren't like a bunch of liberal spendthrifts, right? I mean, these are people who are pretty conservative and that kind of thing. So I think the legislature also has to get a better understanding of what local political subs are dealing with, and they need to figure this out together. It can't just be the legislature saying, we're going to put on caps. Good luck. Go figure it out.
Yeah.
There has to be.
There's got to be collaboration. I agree. Yeah, we had on Neil Messer from Dickinson, Stark County, on not anybody's idea of some spend-happy liberal. Right. Neil's very conservative, but also, immersed in the realities of governing locally and their responsibilities and what they have to do. So that it's
not, Rob, it's not state legislators who get the call when the road isn't plowed. It's not it's the city commissioner, it's the county commissioner. Ryan Taylor has told me before, he's a state senator and then he was a county commissioner after that. He said county commissioner was a much more labor intensive job because when the roads don't get plowed, they're calling their county commissioner.
Those jobs are thankless. So we got to put a pin in it here, but Measure 4 is not the answer, but boy, do we got a lot of work to do in the upcoming session to address this issue.
So Rob, now between now and Friday, we need you to do some deep breathing exercises. Maybe now we're going to talk about marijuana on Friday. There's no reason to get upset and angry about marijuana. Okay.
No,
we'll just have a good conversation on Friday.
I'll be chill. You know what's kind of funny? Because I've long been an advocate, even before it was fashionable. I was the Republican sticking out like a sore thumb, saying we ought to just legalize it. This is stupid. And by the way, which comes from my father, who was a cop, who worked as a vice cop for a while. I got a great story about him buying cocaine in Valdez in the 80s in Alaska and getting caught in a bathroom naked while the drug dealers were trying to kill his partner. You could make a movie out of it. It's unbelievable. Well, but my dad thinks marijuana.
Hey, stick around for future episodes to figure out why Port's dad was naked as part of this.
Because they were in a hotel room and the people they bought drugs from came up to the hotel room and because they were like, we think. Well, they were like, we think you might be cops. So they had been down. Okay, I'm just going to tell the story. They had been down in a bar and they did a buy for cocaine. And so as part of their undercover, they had a hotel room. So they went back to their hotel room. My dad thought it was over. He hops in the shower. His partner's out in the room because, they're state employees. So they had one room. And so the thing is, the guys kick in the door and they come in and they got a gun in my dad's partner's face. And they're saying, we think you're cops. You guys are tricking us. You think you're cops. And my dad's partner's like, no, we're not. And my dad's just in the bathroom with nothing on, doesn't know what to do. And he said the whole time, these guys are finally his partner talks him down. We're not cops. We're not cops. My dad comes out. His badge was sitting on the television the whole time.
Oh, my God.
But
they didn't see it.
Well, no, they didn't see it. And the thing was, they got dressed and then they went out and arrested him. Anyway, great story. My dad thinks marijuana should be legal is the upstart of all that. I think marijuana should be legal. But people accuse me of being a pothead all the time because of that. And it's I tried it once in high school, not for me. And I've never used it since. Not interested in using it.
Well, based on Raging Rob, I think you should start using it.
Mellow out a little bit.
All right. You have a good day.
All right. That's it for today. We'll talk again. That's it for today on Plain Talk, the voice of North Dakota politics. Plain Talk is a production of Forum Communications Company. Got a question, comment, or suggestion? Send me an email at rport@forumcom.com. That's forumcom with 2 M's.com. If you haven't subscribed to Plain Talk yet, you can find us on YouTube or your favorite podcast platform like Spotify or Apple Podcasts. For those of you who are already hooked, give us a rating or review. And don't forget to share or tell a friend. Special thanks to my co-host Chad Oban, and from myself and everyone at Plain Talk, thanks for listening.
somebody described you as Raging Rob.